Hello and welcome back. This is video number 2 in the restoration of the Stanwell bent Bulldog pipe, and I'll give you an update on where we are right now. This is the pipe after an alcohol bath. It was soaked in 70% Everclear, more or less 70%. And I actually wound up soaking it overnight. I had originally intended on only doing a few hours, but I got distracted and it wound up being overnight. Because the pipe was cracked, I wanted to be really careful about drying it, and as you can see here, the crack has actually expanded a bit, and that's, you know, not necessarily good, but we'll be okay with that. There's another issue that I want to show you related to the crack. But at any rate, to dry the pipe, I actually dried it sort of slowly, brought it back up to humidity. So I put it into a plastic bag with a damp paper towel for 2 days. So this all has been several days. Then I opened up the bag for a few days, and then I eventually brought it out and let it dry for a few days. So the idea was to kind of step it up from being submersed in liquid to being close to relative humidity, and to avoid any dramatic stress. But despite that, there's a bit more cracking that's occurred here. I don't think it's any deeper. It's just it's widened out, but that's okay. We'll be able to fix that. What I did notice, and I was able to get that fill out, so we've got a hole there now that we'll deal with. What I did notice, though, which is quite surprising to me, is that this, and I just never noticed, and once this had blackened with you know, tar and soot and whatnot, it was not very obvious, but this pipe actually has an insert sleeve in here. And I do not know if I'm going to be able to get this focused for you, but if you look right here, this black ring, that is actually the top of what I believe is a Delrin sleeve that's going down through the stem of this pipe. What's more unusual is that the mortise on this pipe is not circular. It's an oval shape, and it's actually quite a bit longer in this dimension than in this dimension. And the sleeve seems to have been shaped to fit into that oval mortise and then drilled, because you can possibly see that there is some, like, it's a bit wider on this side here than it is over here. It's actually very thin on this wall. So apparently this was misdrilled, and then a Delrin insert was put in, and then it was re-drilled. This explains a lot, because this stem, if you remember, it was very tight to put it in. I don't want to put it in now because I don't want to put any stress on this, but it was very tight when it would initially go in, and then it would loosen up and seat, and then everything was fine. It turns out this stem is really oddly shaped, and I'll show you more about that when we work on this stem. But it was clearly crushed and shaped to fit into this mortise. Anyway, it's not surprising that given all this, there was some stress put on this. So this Stanwell second is really a second, and I had no idea that it had this much of an issue. So I guess the good thing is we found it. The question is, what do we do with it now? So part of me wants to just pack this up and send it off to a pro to have it banded. But part of me is thinking that I should get that insert out and see if there's anything I can do to re-stem this. And one possibility is that I could get rid of the tenon on the original stem, use a Delrin insert that I could then turn down to fit the mortise. But the problem is the mortise is not circular. So I'm really at a bit of a loss for how to proceed with this. If it were circular, then this would be a good option, and there's nothing that I can re-drill. So I'm not exactly sure how we're going to go forward with this. I'm going to think on that for a while. And in the meantime, I still want to take care of this fill. So that's what we're going to tackle next, and I'll show you how we're going to do that. Or I'll tell you and then show you. So we're going to use, for this, I'm going to use epoxy, and because it's a relatively large fill and it's at a point that's, you know, pretty easy to see, I'm going to use some epoxy mixed with some briar dust. So this is the same procedure that you saw me use on the LJ Peretti billiard, but in this case with the addition of briar dust. So 5-minute clear epoxy, enough briar dust to kind of make it a thick paste, and then we're just going to jam that in there. And what we're going to do is I've got some little strips of business card, the old business cards that I've cut up, and they fit pretty easily in there. If you use 2, they will actually sandwich in there quite tightly. And what I'm hoping to do is to use some pieces of this to go in and form a little dam on either side of that ring that will allow me to apply the filling material into the cavity without filling the ring. I'll coat these with some beeswax before actually going ahead and putting the epoxy on them, just to help them release, because I don't want to epoxy a couple of pieces of business card to my pipe. And that should be it. So what I will do is I'll get that set up, and just before I'm going to mix up the epoxy, I'll bring you back and show you the process. Okay, so I am back, and what I've done here is I've taken some bits of business card stock, and I've waxed it with some beeswax. Just ran a bit of beeswax across the card to help prevent the epoxy from sticking to it as best I can. And then I've jammed that 2 layers into each of the rings, right around where I want to put this fill in. And this is going to be tough for you to see because you got to get the angle just right. It's going to be tough for me to show you, not necessarily tough for you to see. But there is a hole right in there, and there is a very tiny hole right in there. So that's where I'm going to be trying to get the epoxy briar dust mix. The epoxy that I'm using is just a simple 5-minute epoxy, so nothing terribly exciting there. And I'm trying to get out some toothpicks that I'll be using to mix and apply it. So simple rounded toothpicks. They have a nice sharp point on them, so it makes them good for this kind of detail work. Got the basic 5-minute epoxy. I'm going to be mixing this up on a piece of wax paper. Normally I use aluminum foil, but it's shiny and the light bounces off of it too much, so I'm just going to go ahead and use the wax paper today. The wax paper gets a little soft from this, so it's not ideal. You can poke through it. The aluminum foil works well. And I do a fair amount of epoxy mixing for when I build fly rods. And I've got a little piece of wood that I just Forstner bitted a depression in, and I'll just take aluminum foil and stuff it down into there, and I can mix up a large amount of epoxy in that pretty effectively. So, but this will work. So I'm just mixing this two-part 5-minute epoxy. Just mixing the 2 parts together. We're not concerned about getting too many air bubbles or anything. This is all gonna just add to the sort of masking quality of the epoxy. Now if we put it on like this, it's basically going to dry clear, and you're going to pick up some of the color of the surrounding briar. If it's a deep enough fill, it's going to look black, neither of which are going to be unattractive. I'd like this to potentially, if it's not going to pick up, if it's not going to turn out black, I'd like it to pick up some of the stain a little bit better. So to facilitate that, I've got some briar dust, which is just dust that I collect when I sand briar down, and I'm just going to add some of that to the epoxy. And this is just adding something that can possibly pick up some stain. Don't know if it's terribly necessary, but It's easy enough to do, and the briar dust is free, assuming you're sanding briar. And you can see that starts to, looks almost like a caramel color. All right, there we go. So we only get a few minutes to work with this, so I'm going to go ahead and try to get it where it needs to be. So we'll start off with a dollop here in the center. Now keep in mind, as we've discussed before with the Peretti pipe, I'm not too concerned about being proud of the surface. I want to be proud of the surface because I plan to sand this. I mean, that's the whole point. We're trying to get the hole filled, leave some above, and then we'll sand it down level with the original briar. And what I'm doing now is I'm just poking down into that hole, trying to make sure that I really fill it. I don't want an air pocket underneath it. That should be good. And now we'll just come around for this little guy, which you may or may not be able to see, but I assure you it's there. And I really hope that wax releases. If it doesn't, we'll be able to clean the bits of card off. Okay, that's more than we need. And now just using a non-leaden tip here. Oh, no, that's not what I wanted to happen. Alright, well, hopefully that won't be too problematic. Time will tell. What happened, in case you didn't catch it, is the card came out. The fear is that I'm going to be epoxying the bottom of that card into the bottom of the ring, which I probably am going to do, and it's probably going to happen on both sides because I couldn't wax the edge of the card, but that's not going to be a major issue. I mean, I'll be able to get it out, and I can get in there with you know, a metal, a needle or a pick or something, and clean that out. And of course it'll stain fine, so I'm not terribly worried about that. Anyway, let's let the epoxy cure. Now it's a 5-minute epoxy, but I'm not going to do anything with this for probably about 24 hours, just to make sure that it's good and set for sanding. So I will bring you back after we've sanded this down. I'll sand the whole stummel down. I'm not going to do anything down here in the shank. I'm just trying to focus on getting this part in shape. Still trying to decide what to do with this, if this is something I want to tackle or if this is something I want to leave to a pro. So we shall see. I'll see you shortly. Well, gentlemen, we have gone down the rabbit hole with this pipe, and I can only hope that we're going to be able to climb back out again. Some interesting problems have developed, and I will explain those. First off, the good news. The fill has come out quite nicely. This is the area where we had that awful pink fill that was bridging the ring, and you can see that I've been able to restore the integrity of that ring. It passes all the way through. And while this is a little bit darker, with some staining, this will cover up and will not be noticeable. You've seen how that works on previous pipes. So overall, I'm pretty happy with this. The rings continue straight on through there. So it's been cleaned up nicely. These burns, unfortunately, I couldn't do much more than that without really removing a lot of briar, and I don't want to do that. So we'll leave those in, see how they blend in with the staining. Maybe we can do something to sort of darken the top up a bit to hide that. I don't know if I'll do that or not. On the crack on the shank, things are not so happy. This crack was a lot more extensive once I got on the inside here. And the reason, and I have glued it, filled it, and everything, and so this is basically done. Unfortunately, that meant I lost the stamping, but that's okay because this is going to have to be banded. In order for this pipe to not continue to crack and to maintain its integrity, I am going to have to get a band put on this. So I'll do that after I complete the steps that I'm going to do. After this is restored, I'll then send it away and get it banded as a final step. The reason this cracked, though, is interesting and sort of a little lesson in engineering, if you will. This hole, as you can see, I hope, is, let's see if we can focus that in a bit better. This is quite a bit off center. You can see the wall over here is a lot thicker than the wall over here. And in fact, the minimum thickness of this wall, at least the suggested parameters for a pipe, is 1/8 of an inch, which would be 0.0125 inches. This is actually only 0.125, not 0.0125. So 1/8 would be 0.125 inches. This wall is actually only 0.082 inches. So it's 43 thousandths under, which is quite a bit when you're talking about something as small as 1/8 of an inch. And of course this one is thicker because it was drilled off center. Now to compensate for that, what the manufacturer did, and remember I am the only owner of this pipe, so this is how it came from Savinelli. It was a second, but this is how it was manufactured. A piece of plastic insert was put in here, and this is not Delrin, which I originally thought it was. It's actually a rather cheap plastic, something like you might find in a ballpoint pen. And this was inserted in probably as a solid piece. It was glued in place, and then it was drilled. And you can see the drilling is actually asymmetric. I hope you'll be able to see. Let me shine a light on that and maybe, yeah. So you can see that they actually drilled more off of the side that is currently to the right of to our right. And that actually broke through at that point as it got much thinner. The other side is a bit thicker. And that was to try to bring this back on center. So I've taken this out. This clearly was not helping very much in terms of the integrity of the pipe. The reason they did that, I believe, is that this hole, well, I don't understand why they would have done this. This hole is much larger than it needs to be. This is actually a 21/64 hole. And typically a mortise hole would be something around a 9/32. So this is about 31 thousandths too big. Interestingly, the tenon on the pipe, if you measure down here at the base, is I believe it's very close to 9/32, which would be about 0.28. So this is properly sized for a reasonable mortise, but you can see it's a very, very loose fit. So it's almost like they intentionally over-drilled this, put in the plastic insert, and then machined that to take the tenon. The problem is that it didn't fit. It apparently did not work out very well for them. Let's see if I can get a little bit more light on this because it's not. There we go. That hopefully will help. It didn't work out because the tenon, if we bring in a pair of calipers here, and I'll see if I can get this into focus for you. Alright, so you can see the calipers there. Don't worry about the numbers or how to read it, just look at the dial. So if I go right around the base of the tenon and I'm holding that in and I'm now turning the stem, you can see it stays pretty constant. Alright, and that is right around 0.75, well, I'm sorry, it's actually 2.75. 0.275, not doing very well with decimals today. So 0.275 at 9/32 would be 0.28. Okay, so that's great. What's interesting though is if we come all the way up to the end here, and this is the part that was giving me trouble inserting it into this pipe. You can see it's much larger. It's more like 0.278 now. But if I rotate this, watch what happens. It drops all the way down, and then it goes all the way back up again and drops down again. What they did in order to fit this, in order to get it to stay in this insert, it was a loose fit, so they heated it and crushed it to expand it out in one direction. Now by doing that, you get a fit that is rather tight when it goes in, but then once it passes, it's fairly loose. See, so this can turn now. That initial inserting, getting that thickened end through this pipe over and over again, put stress on this thin wall and ultimately caused this to crack. So that's the problem. So the solution to that is going to be a bit more involved than I had originally thought, because I thought we would just keep the stem as is. Now I would like to keep the Savinelli logo. Sorry, I don't know why I'm getting so many shadows today. So I would like to keep the Savinelli logo, so I want to do is minimal sanding on this. And so far I've limited the sanding to this area here where the stamping was. If I have to then sand this, this down to fit, that's okay. I'll still be able to maintain the logo. But how do I account for this, and how do I strengthen this? Well, a band will go a long way to strengthen it, but the truth is that with this being so thin, I don't think the band's going to be enough unless we were to band it all the way up the shank. So what I've decided to do is I have turned a small insert, and this was turned on a wood lathe, and it's simply a tube of, this is actually cherry. Briar is, in my experience, is a bit too brittle to do something like this with, so I did not use briar. I used cherry, which is still a hardwood and still should be perfectly fine. And this is designed to be a slightly loose fit, so it'll slide in there with no problem. So I'll be able to epoxy this in place, and it seats right down at the bottom, right where this would have been, right where this insert would have seated. And what I will do is I will epoxy this in place, cut it off flush, chamfer it a bit, and then we will turn this tenon down to the diameter of this, which is 1/4 inch. So it's a little bit smaller than I'd like a tenon to be, but at least that will provide some reinforcement for these walls to prevent that from cracking further, and will allow us to use the original stem. Again, this is not going to be a daily smoker or even a monthly smoker for me, so I'm trying to maintain the integrity of the pipe as much as possible, not going for an ideal repair in this case. So that will be glued in place, cut off flush, as I said, and I've left this rough so that there'll be plenty of surface for the epoxy to grab onto and hopefully provide a nice fix for this problem. So those will be the next steps. I will go ahead and permanently put that in place. We won't work on the stem just yet. Once that's in place, I'll do the final sanding on this, and it will be stained and pretty much ready to receive the stem. So that's all the work we're going to do on the stummel. And then the stem, which will be the purpose of the point of the next video, we're going to fill in these holes, as I mentioned before. But before I do any of that, I want to turn this down and make sure that we can get a reasonable fit here. Because if this winds up not being flush, if we wind up with something akin to that, where I would have to lose a lot of this ebonite and would lose the stamping on the stem, or the trademark on the stem, I'm not going to do it. I don't want to lose this stem. So what I would do then is I would get a new stem and replace it, and just keep this one aside. So I'm not going to do all this repair work until I'm sure that I have to do it. So that'll hold off until probably the final video. So we'll get this finished up. That'll be glued in place, and when I see you next, I will be ready to either turn down the tenon on this stem. Well, I will turn down the tenon on this stem. We'll see how it fits, and then we'll decide whether we're going to use this stem and repair the area around the button, or if we're going to switch to a new stem, which will have to be fitted and sanded to the right dimensions. After that's done, the stummel will be stained and polished, and the stem will be polished and will be done. With the exception of this pipe is then going to be sent off to a pro who will put a metal band, probably something like a 1/4 inch metal band on here, just to ensure that this is not going to crack any further. Even though it's not going to be smoked that often, I don't want it to just wind up cracking in the pipe rack. So that's where we are now. This was an interesting problem, and I guess a word to the wise. It's sure, the pipe's a second. You don't expect it to be top quality, but I usually think of seconds as having fills in them, not so much as having major engineering flaws like this. This pipe was destined to break, essentially. So that's where we are. I will sign off this video at this point, and I hope you will tune in for the next one. If you're not a subscriber, please do subscribe so you can keep up to date on this and other projects. If you are a subscriber, thank you. I really appreciate it, and I appreciate any comments you might have on the pipe or the process. And I will look forward to seeing you for what I hope will be the final video in this series very soon. Take care now.